Imagine it's 19th of September 1880. You are a 48-year-old land agent living in Ballinrobe, Ireland. Each morning you ride out from Loftmask House with a ledger in your saddlebag and a list of rents to collect for Lord Ern's estate. Your house is solid, your table is full, and your place in the district feels fixed, like a stone wall that has stood for generations. You know which tenant pays on time, which field floods in heavy rain, and which roof needs patching before winter. The harvest has been poor, but you still believe the old order will hold because it always has. You think next month will look like last month, and the month after that will look the same again. If you have ever wondered what really happens to landlords when tenants suddenly stop paying rent, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory, it is a pattern. It has happened before, in different countries, under different flags, in different centuries. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Then Charles Stewart Parnell gives a speech in nearby Ennis. He says that when a man takes a farm from which another tenant has been evicted, the community should not touch him, not speak to him, not trade with him. The idea spreads like cold air under a door. Soon boycotts workers stop working. Shops in Ballinrobe refuse to serve him. Mail stops. Neighbours turn away. And when Lord Ern's tenants facing bad harvests ask for a 25% cut in rent and get only 10%, the argument is no longer about one missed payment. It becomes a test of power. That is the deeper story in this video. People think a landlord's danger begins when cash stops arriving. History shows it begins earlier, when a whole system starts leaning on one monthly promise. Rent looks simple. A tenant pays, an owner collects. But under that simple exchange sits a stack of debts, taxes, repairs, salaries, habits, court rules, and social expectations. When tenants stop paying, whether because they cannot, will not, or are legally protected from eviction, landlords do not all suffer in the same way. Some are ruined fast, some bend and survive, a few even come out stronger. To understand why, we need to go backward through history and watch the floor give way, one rent payment at a time. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. A rental property is not just a building. It is a machine that must be fed every month. If the rent stops, the machine does not stop asking for fuel. The mortgage still comes due. Property taxes still come due. The roof still leaks. The boiler still breaks. The hallway light still burns out. In plain English, the money going out often keeps moving even when the money coming in freezes. That is the core mechanism. A landlord is usually not sitting on a pile of gold in a cellar. More often, especially with small owners, he is walking a tightrope over fixed costs. Fixed costs means bills that stay there no matter what. If one tenant misses a payment in a 20-unit building, the owner feels pain. If 6 tenants miss payments in a 4-unit building, the owner may be finished. Scale matters. Cash reserves matter. Debt matters. The law matters too. A legal pause on evictions, which means a temporary rule stopping landlords from removing non-paying tenants, can turn a short cash problem into a long survival problem. On the other hand, an inflation shock, which means prices rising so fast that money loses value, can wipe out a landlord's debts even while it destroys his rental income. That sounds strange. It is strange, and history is full of these reversals. So think of rent as the heartbeat of a much larger body. When the beat skips once, the body jolts. When it skips for months, every organ starts failing at a different speed. The plumber goes unpaid, maintenance is delayed, the bank gets nervous, the owner cuts repairs, the tenant lives with mold or cold. Then politics arrives. Relief programs, court orders, rent freezes, protests, evictions. Each one is an attempt to hold up a roof that was already sagging. This is why the story is never just about landlords or just about tenants. It is about a chain. And when one link snaps, the whole chain whips. This brings us directly to New York in the Great Depression, where the pattern appears in one of its clearest forms. By late 1931, unemployment had spread through working-class neighborhoods like floodwater in a basement. People were not refusing rent because they had suddenly discovered a political theory. Many simply had no cash, jobs vanished, savings vanished, pride vanished last. In the Bronx, Harlem, Brooklyn, and other parts of the city, rent stopped not as a single dramatic act, but as 1,000 quiet household collapses happening behind thin walls. From late 1931 to mid-1932, more than 180,000 eviction notices were served across New York City. Think about that number for a moment. Not a few unlucky streets, an entire city shaking. In early January 1932, rent strikes began in 3 large Bronx buildings, including 2302 Olinville Avenue and 665 Allerton Avenue. At Olinville Avenue, when marshals moved to evict 17 tenants, more than 4,000 people showed up. Furniture was carried back inside, police pushed forward, crowds pushed back. The city was learning a brutal lesson. When enough tenants cannot pay at once, eviction stops being a private legal matter and becomes public disorder. The details matter because they show how fast ordinary life can turn. At 665 Allerton Avenue, the attempted eviction of just 3 tenants required more than 50 police. On Longfellow Avenue, a 5-building strike ended only after 40 evictions, an injunction against picketing, and a trail of arrests and injuries. By February 1933, one alarmed real estate writer warned that more than 200 buildings in the Bronx were already caught up in active rent strikes. That is what large-scale non-payment looks like in practice. It is not one dramatic crash. It is a whole city trying to move furniture, paper, people, and authority through streets that no longer accept the usual rules. For landlords, this was a trap with walls closing in from both sides. On one side were unpaid rents. On the other side were courts, protests, and the cost of physically removing families who had neighbors willing to fight for them. Some Bronx landlord organizations formed rent strike committees by February 1932 and offered what reports described as unlimited legal support to owners facing strikes. That sounds powerful. But even organized landlords were trying to hold back a tide with paperwork. Mass eviction notices cost money. Police protection cost political capital. Empty units brought in no rent. Buildings still needed heat, janitors, coal, and repairs. A landlord could win in court and still lose in cash. Now look closer at what ordinary people experienced. Families were put on the sidewalk with chairs, blankets, pots, and children. Crowds gathered not because they loved disorder, but because the sight was unbearable. A family's private shame became a neighborhood warning. I am next. You are next. That feeling mattered. The anti-eviction movement was not powered only by ideology. It was powered by recognition. People saw their own future in someone else's mattress sitting in the street. One later account said these actions helped restore as many as 77,000 families to their homes citywide. Whether every number was exact or not, the scale of desperation was unmistakable. Now here is where it gets interesting. The landlords who were hurt most were not always the biggest villains in the story. Large real estate interests had lawyers, influence, and more room to wait. But many smaller owners were squeezed hard. A building with heavy debt is like a wagon loaded for a mountain road. It looks stable until the horse stops, then the full weight reveals itself. A landlord depending on rent from 1 or 2 buildings could fall behind on taxes or maintenance faster than a giant company with cash reserves. In a crisis, moral pictures blur. The struggling tenant and the struggling owner can both be real at the same time. And what ended the worst of this phase was not a sudden return of harmony, it was outside money. By June 1933, nearly 500 rent checks were reportedly being issued to unemployed Bronx families because public relief finally began to move. Mayor O'Brien ordered city marshals to give tenants time to receive aid before carrying out evictions. That matters. The lesson is simple and hard. When tenants stop paying on a large scale, the market rarely solves it cleanly. The state enters, because without intervention the damage spreads outward. Buildings decay, streets fill with protest, courts clog, owners fail, families are uprooted, the problem becomes too big to stay private. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. When rent stops coming in, who is really carrying the risk in a city like this? The tenant, the landlord, the bank, or the government? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear. And it changes everything. Long before New York, the same struggle had already changed the English language. In 1880, on Lord Ern's estate in County Mayo, Charles Boycott faced a problem more dangerous than a few late payments. He faced coordinated non-payment backed by social exile. The harvest had been poor. Tenants wanted a 25% cut in rent. Boycott would go no lower than 10% and issued eviction notices against 11 tenants. That decision looked firm on paper. In real life, it detonated his authority. What happened next was not a riot. It was, in some ways, worse. Workers stopped harvesting. Blacksmiths refused service. Postmen stopped calling. Shops in Ballinrobe would not sell to him. He was not merely resisted, he was made untouchable. It was a kind of economic quarantine. The community turned him into a ghost while he was still alive. That is where the word boycott entered the language. This case matters because it shows that landlords do not lose only through empty ledgers. They can lose through broken legitimacy. If the whole local economy decides your claim on rent is no longer moral, collection becomes almost impossible. A court can issue papers, a government can send soldiers, but soldiers cannot restore the quiet cooperation that makes rent collection normal in the first place. That cooperation is invisible in stable times. In crisis, it turns out to be everything, and there was real money at stake. Boycott eventually had to rely on a military-backed effort to bring in workers from Ulster to harvest crops. The episode became famous because the cost of protecting that harvest was absurdly high compared with what was being saved. In other words, winning became more expensive than losing. That is one of history's great warnings. When a landlord is forced to spend extraordinary resources just to enforce an ordinary contract, the old business model is already broken. This leads to the second part of this story. The Irish Land War was not just about one man, it was about a whole system of landlordism under stress. The movement began in 1879, and the most intense phase ran through 1882. Under the Irish National Land League, tenants used rent strikes, pressure funds, and public shaming to demand fair rents, fixity of tenure, and eventually ownership. During the later plan of campaign, from 1886 to 1891, tenants on targeted estates would decide what they believed was a fair rent, offer that lower amount, and if the landlord refused, pay into a defense fund instead. That strategy was aimed especially at the most indebted and financially weak landlords, the ones who had to choose between immediate bankruptcy and accepting less. Notice how modern this feels. The people who broke first were not always the largest owners. They were the thinly capitalized ones. That means owners with too little spare money to absorb a shock. A landlord with large debts is like a glass window under pressure. It can look solid right up until the hairline crack runs across the whole pane. Once tenants learned which estates were heavily burdened, they knew where pressure would work fastest. The rent strike became a tool not just of protest, but of financial diagnosis. It revealed who was truly strong and who was living on borrowed time. And the result was not simply unpaid rent, it was political restructuring. The Land Law Act of 1881 created fair rent tribunals. Later land acts expanded ways for tenant farmers to buy land. By the early 20th century, much of the old landlord system had been dismantled. That is important because it shows that mass rent resistance does not always end with everyone going back to the way things were. Sometimes it changes who gets to own at all. For ordinary people, the experience was harsh and physical. Evicted Irish families could see roofs unthatched or homes broken so they could not return. Relief funds supported some, others emigrated. Hunger sat in the background of every negotiation like a wolf at the edge of the field. For landlords and land agents, the lesson was equally harsh. Income that seemed rooted in tradition turned out to depend on consent, enforcement, and local peace. Remove those, and the income stream can vanish almost overnight. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. Not all non-payment is born from personal failure. Sometimes it comes from crop failure. Sometimes from depression. Sometimes from law. Sometimes from a political movement that persuades people to stop treating rent as sacred. In each case, the landlord's problem is larger than any single tenant. The problem is that the social habit of paying has cracked. Once that habit breaks, it is very hard to glue it back together with threats alone. Now take the pattern forward to Germany, where rent did not just fall behind. It dissolved in real value. During the Weimar hyperinflation of 1921 to 1923, which means prices rose so fast that money itself lost meaning, landlords discovered a nightmare with a twist. On paper, tenants were still paying rent. In reality, the rent could be almost worthless by the time it was collected. Imagine trying to fill a bucket while the bottom is melting away. That was rental income in Germany by 1923. The numbers are famous because they sound unreal. By November 1923, $1 was worth 4.21 trillion German marks. Workers were sometimes paid more than once a day, so they could spend wages before prices jumped again. Savers were ruined, pensioners were ruined, and landlords on fixed nominal rents, which means rents written as fixed money amounts, were hit especially hard. Later descriptions from the European Central Bank noted that people on fixed incomes, including landlords, faced impoverishment. Another study found that strict rent regulation made housing almost free for tenants during the hyperinflation. Now pause there. This is one of the most counterintuitive facts in the whole story. Many people assume real estate always protects the owner during inflation. History says not so fast. A house is not the same thing as income from a house. If your building is valuable, but the rent you can legally collect is frozen while money is collapsing, you may own a strongbox that pays you in dust. The building stands. The cash flow dies. In Berlin and other cities, that meant maintenance became difficult, repairs were delayed, and landlords watched the real buying power of rent collapse month after month. Picture a widow living from the rent on one apartment building. On Monday, the payment might buy coal. By Friday, it might buy bread. By the end of the month, it might buy almost nothing. That is what fixed income means inside hyperinflation. It means being paid in numbers that no longer touch the real world. And when maintenance is delayed long enough, the loss compounds. A stair rots. A pipe bursts. The property that was supposed to preserve wealth starts consuming it. But there was a twist. Some urban landlords also benefited because inflation wiped out old mortgage debts. One study estimates that 40 billion marks of mortgage debt, roughly 1/6 of German wealth in 1913, was erased by inflation. So which landlords survived? Often the ones whose debts vanished faster than their properties deteriorated, or the ones with assets they could sell or reuse after the storm passed. Which landlords were crushed? Those relying on rental income as a steady living, those without the right debt structure, and those trapped under regulations that kept rent far below the cost of upkeep. This is why collapse is rarely a clean fire. It behaves more like acid. It eats one surface quickly and leaves another almost untouched. Tenants in this period could appear to be paying, yet landlords still lost. The monthly envelope arrived, but inside it was less and less real life. Less coal, less food, less labor, less repair. Money had become theater. Ordinary people felt this in humiliating detail. The middle class saw life savings disappear. Widows and pensioners watched secure incomes turn into jokes. Tenants sometimes benefited from cheap regulated housing, but they lived in a country where shops emptied, social trust shattered, and politics grew poisonous. The point is not that tenants won and landlords lost. The point is that when the monetary system breaks, the rent contract stops, meaning what both sides thought it meant. A lease written for normal times becomes a paper umbrella in a storm. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe, because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Now look at all three together. County Mayo in 1880, the Bronx in 1932, Germany in 1923. Different countries, different decades, different reasons. Same result. A landlord's income only looks solid when the system around it is calm. The same mechanism. Different countries, different decades, same result. In each case, the rent stream failed because something deeper failed first. In Ireland, social consent collapsed. In New York, employment collapsed. In Weimar Germany, money collapsed. But once the deeper layer broke, landlords were pulled into the same machine. That machine has 4 gears. First, tenants lose either ability or willingness to pay. Second, landlords keep facing fixed costs or fixed expectations. Third, enforcement becomes expensive, slow, or politically dangerous. Fourth, someone absorbs the loss. Sometimes the landlord, sometimes the tenant through eviction or worse housing, sometimes the bank, sometimes the state through relief money or legal changes. Often all 4 share it. This is the secret key most people miss. Rent is not a moral category, it is a transmission belt. When the engine above it fails, pressure travels through the belt until something below snaps. That is why the argument over unpaid rent becomes so emotional. Everyone senses that someone is about to be chosen to eat the loss. The tenant says, "I cannot create money I do not have." The landlord says, "Neither can I." The bank says the note is still due. The government says, "Keep order." And history asks the same cruel question again and again. Who has the least power to refuse? At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The owners who survived longest were usually not the ones with the loudest rhetoric. They were the ones with time. Time to wait, time to negotiate, time to absorb months of shortfall, time to use other income, time to repair less without immediate ruin. Time is the hidden currency in every rent crisis. A landlord with cash reserves has time. A landlord with low debt has time. A landlord with access to public relief has time. A landlord whose costs rise every week and whose loans are due now has none. And now the human cost comes into full view because these episodes do not hit everyone equally. The people hurt first are often not giant landlords or the poorest tenants in the headlines. They are the people in the middle. The widow living off 2 upstairs units. The retired couple with a 3-family house. The immigrant shopkeeper who bought a building as a pension substitute. The school teacher renting a modest apartment whose wages do not keep pace. History keeps returning to this middle layer because it lives close enough to stability to believe in it, and close enough to the edge to fall when one pillar moves. You can see that clearly in the pandemic shock of 2020. In the United States, rent non-payment did not explode evenly, and landlord pain did not either. By April 5, 2020, only 69% of apartment households in a major national data set had made a full or partial rent payment, down from 82% at the same point the year before. The dataset covered 13.4 million units. That was not a small warning light. It was a city-sized alarm bell. In 31 cities tracked by Eviction Lab, eviction filings fell 57.6% between March 15, 2020 and December 31, 2021, with 800,000 fewer cases than expected. That sounds like relief, and for many tenants it was relief. But it also meant many landlords were being legally prevented from solving a cash problem through the one tool the system normally gave them: removal for non-payment. Now again, the pain was uneven. Research from JP Morgan Chase found that median landlord rental revenue fell about 20% in the spring of 2020, though many larger or better capitalized owners cut expenses and stabilized balances later. Roughly 7% of landlords missed mortgage payments. For small landlords in Albany and Rochester, one Harvard study found that only 59.6% of properties had full rent paid by June 15, 2020, and only 53.8% by October 15th. More than 30% of those properties experienced deferred maintenance. That phrase sounds dry. It is not dry. Deferred maintenance means a broken stair stays broken. A leaking pipe keeps leaking. Paint peels. Mold spreads. The building ages in dog years. That is one of the saddest parts of the story. When tenants cannot pay and landlords cannot absorb the loss, the building itself becomes the battlefield. The walls take the punishment first. Housing quality falls long before ownership changes on paper. It is like watching hunger move into a house one repair at a time. A cracked window, a dead boiler, a patched roof that is never truly fixed. History records bankruptcies and court orders. It often misses the quieter damage of people living inside properties that are slowly being starved. And then there is Lebanon after 2019, where another version of the pattern emerged. There, the problem was not just non-payment, but currency collapse and the shift toward dollar rents. In Beirut, one teacher named Nariman Attar had been paying 1.2 million Lebanese lira in rent. When her lease came up for renewal, her landlord told her the new rent would be 2.2 million lira. Her salary was 3 million. 3/4 of her monthly pay would go just to rent. She had to leave. On the other side, some landlords said renting in lira no longer made sense because maintenance costs were increasingly tied to dollars. One Beirut landlord told reporters the rent he received on his apartment amounted to around $160 at market rates, and said his son's toys were worth more than that. By 2022, a Beirut Urban Lab survey found 75% of respondents were paying rent in US cash, up from roughly 30 to 35% in 2020. Notice the rhyme with Weimar. The building still stands, the contract still exists, but the money inside the contract has changed shape. What looks like payment from one angle looks like loss from another, and again the middle gets crushed. Tenants are pushed out by rents they cannot meet. Landlords sit on empty units because the rent they can realistically collect will not cover costs, or because they wait for a tenant who can pay in hard currency. The city fills with locked apartments and insecure families at the same time. That is not a housing solution. It is a social wound. In Lebanon, housing monitors recorded at least 115 situations threatening housing security involving 322 residents, including 198 minors, in just the first 4 months of 2021. That is how these crises show up on the ground, not as a neat chart, but as children moving schools, families splitting households, furniture carried up and down stairwells, and owners staring at buildings that are somehow both assets and burdens. A city can have empty apartments and housing insecurity at the same time, because the problem is not only physical space, it is the broken bridge between price, income, and trust. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing. And it might change everything. So what did the survivors do differently? Not the winners in a flashy sense. Not the people who got rich off misery. I mean the people who came through without being destroyed. The historical record shows that those who came through these periods largely shared 3 characteristics, even though they lived in different centuries and very different economies. First, they had margin. Margin means breathing room. In plain English, they were not one missed payment away from panic. Sometimes that meant low debt, sometimes cash reserves, sometimes another job, another business, family land, or a pension outside rent. In New York during the Depression, large owners and institutions could often wait longer than the owner of 1 or 2 buildings. In the pandemic, better capitalized landlords could absorb missed rent or cut expenses without immediately missing mortgage payments. Time, again, was everything. A landlord with margin does not become wise. He just gets to stay in the game long enough to adjust. Second, they adapted to the real unit of value. That sounds abstract, so let's say it simply. They understood what kind of money actually mattered. In inflation, the real unit may not be the official currency at all. In Lebanon, landlords who demanded dollars were reacting to that shift, however painful the social result. In Weimar, landlords with debts sometimes survived because inflation erased those debts, while landlords living off fixed rent incomes were ruined. The surprising fact is this: owning property did not automatically protect you. Understanding how the payment system itself was changing mattered more. Third, they treated rent as a relationship before it became a court case. This is not moral advice, it is historical observation. In crisis after crisis, owners who could negotiate, reduce, delay, restructure, or work with relief systems often lasted longer than those who moved straight to punishment. During the pandemic, small landlords often offered repayment plans. During earlier crises, public relief or mediated settlements sometimes saved both sides from worse outcomes. The owner who insists on full payment in a broken economy may feel principled. He may also be trying to squeeze water from stone. Now, that does not mean softness always wins. History is not sentimental. Some owners survived because they had political connections, some because they held property without debt and could wait through empty periods, some because the law shifted in their favor, some because relief payments eventually arrived. During the pandemic in the United States, more than $46 billion in emergency rental assistance was ultimately made available, with over 10 million assistance payments made. That is a reminder that in modern crises, survival can depend not only on the tenant and landlord, but on whether the state builds a temporary bridge before both sides drown. But across cases, the common thread is clear. Survivors saw the crisis as a change in system, not just a defect in tenant character. They knew that when a bridge collapses, yelling at the cars does not rebuild it. They recognize the difference between a bad tenant and a broken environment. That difference is everything. Miss it, and every response comes too late. Bring yourself back now to Ballinrobe, Ireland. Bring yourself back to that September day in 1880, to the neat ledger, the horse, the house that felt permanent. Charles Boycott did not disappear because one tenant missed one payment. He was overwhelmed because the wider structure holding up rent collapsed around him. The same was true in the Bronx, when unemployment hollowed out whole neighborhoods. The same was true in Weimar Germany when money itself became unstable. The same rhyme appeared when pandemic job losses met eviction pauses, and when Lebanon's currency breakdown turned payment into an argument over what money even was. What happened to Boycott in the end? He left Loft Mask House under escort on 27 November 1880. His name became a word. That may be the strangest ending of all. A man who tried to enforce rent gave the English language a term for organized refusal. History has a sense of irony sharp enough to cut glass. And that is the final lesson. When tenants suddenly stop paying rent, the first thing to disappear is not always income. Sometimes it is certainty. Certainty that the law will enforce the old order. Certainty that money will hold value. Certainty that neighbors will stay passive. Certainty that a property is a safe, simple asset. History shows the reality is more fragile and more human. Rent rests on work, trust, value, and power. When one of those breaks, the monthly payment becomes the place where the whole crisis shows its face. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.